now. Okay.
Hey, got it. There we go. Okay. So today we're going to talk about adolescence. And the title is Inviting Conversations, Adolescent Themes of Engagement. And I'm Jennifer Morgan Smith. And I'll let John introduce himself and then we'll move to the next slide.
Yeah, I'm John Robbins. My full-time job is I teach for a CMHC program for Walden University online, but I've worked for about 23 years in community mental health around, and I'm getting the echo now.
I'm muting people as we.
Okay. And primarily with adolescents. So this is a topic, as Jennifer and I talk about it, that's kind of near and dear to my heart. And I was introduced to these ideas that we're going to present today. And then Jennifer and I have talked about this a lot. And one of the things as we go through this that I would want you to know is that for me, when I was introduced, it was just it was like an alternative way of thinking about what I was doing. And so as we talk about this, I don't want it to sound like this is the way you should be doing it. I think it just opens space to think about an alternative ways of entering into conversations with adolescents and entering into working with adolescents, whether it be in a school setting or in a counseling setting. And so I get passionate about it. So sometimes I come off as this is the way, but it's not. For me, it was just a way to open up some space to think about how to work with adolescents in a different way than what I had been doing. So that in and of itself is really what the objectives are. Y'all can read those later. I think Michael sends the PowerPoint to y'all, so y'all can take a look at those. But really, for me, it's thinking about how to enter into these conversations in a more congruent way with the developmental level and the developmental tasks that adolescents are going through. And so the first shift to make, if you go to the next slide, Jennifer, the first shift to make is that a lot of times, especially in treatment programs I've worked in, it was this idea of we need to teach adolescents how to cooperate with us and how to cooperate with adults. And the first shift that a person, his name is Alan Jenkins, he's in the references, so y'all can look him up. But what he said was that how do we think about cooperating with, how do we cooperate with adolescents? How do we cooperate with the people that we work with? And it was a real shift to think about. I hear people a lot of times saying, I want to meet the clients where they are. And yet I think I was trying to bring adolescents along with where I believe they should be, as opposed to meeting them where they are and entering into their understanding of the world and how to cooperate with their understanding of the world instead of trying to teach them how to live in my understanding of the world.
Yeah, the whole idea of meeting clients where they are, it's an interesting concept because we often don't do that. We often meet them where we are in what we're expecting from them. And so it's just a little bit of a tweak in thought.
And I think the play therapists have this down. Really, they get trained hard in that.
Yeah, they do.
How to enter into a child's language as opposed to how to live in an adult's language. And I think that is what Jenkins was saying, was how do we enter into an adolescent's world, and as opposed to having them try to come into our world.
Yeah. And so as John and I were talking about this, I'm a big proponent of trauma-informed care.
Mhm.
And so I looked at like what our guiding principles are of trauma-informed care. And what does that, what does that even mean? What's it about? And so I put these 6 guiding principles here, and it's kind of like in a trauma-informed care environment, these are the 6 things that are included. And so as we were talking about this and how to meet somebody where they are, it's really this collaboration and mutuality. It's empowerment, voice, and choice. It's understanding cultural, historical, gender issues, and all of those things. And that idea of peer support, all of those things are all about meeting a client where they're at and understanding and entering into their world versus bringing them into our world. And so I've included these in here.
Yeah,
That's just part of
I know you've done a deep dive in this. For me, when I was looking at some of the stuff you've been sending me, and maybe they do, I haven't seen it yet, but I wonder about the developmental issues also, because that, you have cultural, historical, and gender, and I'm like in developmental, because
Right.
we if you think of, they're trying to achieve tasks, and that's going to be an important piece for adolescents, is they're trying to meet these tasks, and can we hear them and view them and treat them through that lens?
Right. And to me, developmental piece is that peer support. It's a person with a lived experience and understanding where they come from and what's going on with them, and getting their feedback and their ideas about what they need.
Yeah.
So to me, that's where that includes that developmental task.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of what we're going to talk about also will pull back to trauma-informed care, because
Yeah.
a lot of this has to do with it. When Jenkins came up with these ideas, trauma-informed care was not a thing. This was 25 years ago when he first, probably longer than that, when he first started thinking about this. But it all has to do with these 6 guiding principles.
Yep.
So one of the things that I've been a part of inpatient adolescent treatment programs, and one of the big ideas was around taking responsibility and accountability, and that was an important piece to not only these adolescents becoming independent adults, but also it was an important piece to get their next chip or move up in levels, and that the adolescent was demonstrating taking accountability for themselves and their actions and their thoughts and everything else. And so a lot of what I was involved with was we were basically teaching and directing adolescents into how to be accountable. Yeah, go to the next slide, because I think and this really does go to trauma-informed kind of ideas. But it's how do we, Jenkins was talking about one of the things that residential treatment sometimes does is they define what accountability is. They define the phases, and without a doubt, that's necessary. Obviously, it has to have some sort of structure. But how do we allow the adolescent to have a voice in accountability and what that means, and how accountability looks in an adolescent world. Because oftentimes we're defining accountability through an adult world. And one thing that we'll talk about in another presentation, but adults live in a very results-oriented, practical, defined world. Adolescents don't live in that world. If you've ever been around an adolescent, they live in a very emotional world. And they live in a dramatic world. And so accountability is going to be defined very different for each of them, for adults and adolescents. And oftentimes where there is pushback is adults asking adolescents to come into a rational world where we know developmentally they are in an emotional state pretty much all the time. And so how to give that place a voice in how we're working and how we enter into the conversations with these adolescents. Jennifer, anything?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking like it would be nice to hear. I know that there's several people on here that have a lot of adolescent experience. How many people have a lot of experience with adolescents?
Yeah.
And you can use your little hands up thing too on the, raise your hand. There we go. There's some raising hands. I recognize some of these hands that are going up.
How many have an adolescent? How many have a child that's an adolescent? Because it's the same thing. If you think about your interactions with your kids, you're not working on them, but it's oftentimes adolescents are very much in an emotional state. And when we try to enter into speaking rationally with them, those may not jive as much.
Yeah, and I think I'd love to hear from people. It's like, how do you hold an adolescent accountable in an effective way? Like that's really, the big question. How do we hold them accountable and meet them in that developmental place that they're at? I think that's a big question that we often, wonder about,
And Jennifer, part of it is, do we have space in our jobs or in our world to allow the adolescent to have a part in defining what accountability is? Because if I say I'm going to hold them accountable and don't ask any questions of the adolescent, then they're going to be accountable the way I view it.
Right.
And they're going to be accountable the way I define it. And I'm going to define it from an old man, stay off my lawn, and that'll make you accountable, or whatever. But I won't be defining it with any part of their eyes being a part of it.
And that's interesting because Shelley in the comments says the agreement has to be clear to them. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
how do we make it clear?
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Hi, this is Samantha. When I talk to the adolescents here, I a lot of times will establish their terminology, their wording, and the meaning behind their words so that we're all on the same page. And then I allow them to set the expectations and set the responsibilities of their goals. And then I hold them accountable to their expectations instead of my expectations, so that, for example, when my kids were younger, I would say, what time are you going to be home? Knowing that they had their schedule, and they'd say 10 o'clock. So when they would call me at 9:58 and say, I need more time, I would always say, no, you set the time at 10. I need you to hold that at 10.
He was like, oh, he's like, I would definitely, do you have something else?
Anyways, I would just set that as when I work with the adolescents here, and they would say, this is what I want to do. When I would check back in on them, they'd say, oh, I don't want to do that anymore. I would still hold it to them and say, we either need to redefine, or I need to hold you to what you've agreed to, because this is what you.
Yeah, so it's using their language. Matt Bullock said that I think buy-in is the first step. Yeah, Matt, I mean, it's getting that buy-in and understanding their language, understanding where that adolescent is coming from and what they want to do and what they want to be held accountable to.
I have a good friend that says adolescents can be diagnosed with literal disease, that they take everything literally. And it's funny because there's a kid, it reminded me the Be Home by 10. I had a family that were in an argument because the parents had told their kid they had to be home by, I forget what time. And they went to sleep and woke up at like 2 o'clock in the morning. Their kid wasn't in their room. They heard something, and they heard something outdoors, and they looked outdoors, and the kid was there with all of his friends and they were partying. And he said, I was home at the exact time. And so it was a matter of, what we meant. And he was like, no, you said be home. And that was it. And so I was like, oh God, that's literal disease, because I was reminded of that. And so anyway, that's way off the topic, but in some ways it's not, because that's what we're about to talk about with the themes of engagement.
Yeah.
And the themes really come from this idea of, can we think of adolescent interactions as being defined by their developmental tasks and where they are developmentally? And so the first three themes are very similar in many ways. The desire for independence and self-supervision. And you will never have an adolescent say, hey, I just desire independence and self-supervision. They'll say, leave me alone. And they'll probably drop an F-bomb in there with it, just for their emotional state. And by the way, adolescents invite us into emotional interactions. And they're not doing it intentionally. They're just inviting us into their world. And they'll do it in many ways that's for, again, another time. But they're interacting with us in emotional states. But what I like about these themes is that if you can think of what they're saying as based on one of these themes.
There we go.
And so leave me alone may sound inappropriate, and don't tell me, but that's their bid for independence. That's their bid for maturity. That's their desire for self-control rather than being influenced by the adult.
Yeah, and I think we can think of a lot of different interactions with teenagers that fit into these categories. There's just so many of them. They want to have their own decision-making power. And so Sam's idea of asking, like, what time do you need to be home? Like, what time, let's let's talk that through. And it's saying like, you have a voice in this discussion. So let's talk that through and figure it out. I mean, if he'd said, I'm going to be home at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, then there's more discussion.
Yeah. Or if Sam would have said, you're going to be home at 10.
Yeah.
That's and that's entering into a conversation where it wouldn't be paying attention to some of these themes, where it's like, let's have this discussion. When do you want to be home? It opens up some space for them to then have some self-control, not be influenced by the adult, and that there is, can you go to the next slide, Jennifer? Here's the other three themes: that there is respect, it's a respectful relationship, it's a fair relationship, and that and that there's a self-respect. And so these actually, respect and fair, justice and equity to me is fairness. Those run rampant in adolescence. You see it all the time. And I'll see adolescents where I've tried to tell them who they should be or what they should be. And there have been many times where I've said something to an adolescent that I would never say to an adult. And they're in this developmental space of things needing to be respectful. And I have caught myself many times doing something that I would think would be very disrespectful if somebody did it to me. If somebody told me who I should be or how I should be, it would feel disrespectful. And I don't know about y'all's tendency. My tendency is to push back. And so when an adolescent pushes back, I think I don't give them as much permission. I don't try to understand what was my part in entering into this conversation that felt disrespectful.
Yeah. What did I say? What did I do that maybe triggered them to start asserting this and asserting their need for justice and fairness? Brooke talked about the TBRI, principle of a compromise.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what we're talking about. Yeah. It's how we then recognize the developmental milestones and needs of adolescents and understand that this is how they're going to engage with us.
And one of the things I would say in thinking about compromise is, how do we even enter into that? Because if I'm saying, well, why don't we compromise? I'm still in power. Instead of asking a question like, how should we handle this? How would you want to go about handling us disagreeing on this?
What do you want this support to look like?
Yeah. And, it's not fair. When they say it's not fair, I'm always interested in asking, well, who do you want to be in the face of unfairness? Instead of when I first started working, I thought I needed to be the teacher. And so when things aren't fair, I'm going to either try to teach them about what makes it unfair, or why it's being done, or how to handle unfairness, or whatever, instead of being curious about how they want to be, which goes back to giving them some space for their own independence and looking at who they want to be. And one of the things I think I feel passionate about this is, where it comes from, is as soon as I started asking adolescents, who do you want to be in the face of this? It seemed so foreign to them to be asked that, especially the folks that had been through like several residential treatment programs, to have some space for them to consider it. And quite honestly, it threw them. Because they were way more used to being told who they should be or how they should be than to have to come up with it themselves and define the type of adult they want to be.
Yeah.
So with those themes in mind, which I think are important, because it's going to show up if you buy into these are themes of an adolescent, then you're going to start seeing these in everything that an adolescent does.
So if we quickly review, I'm going to jump back a slide because there's all 6 of them right here. So the independence, self-supervision, the maturity, their desire to grow up, to have self-control, to have self-respect, to have respectful relationships, and to have justice and fairness. So does anyone find that those aren't accurate themes of adolescence? Anyone see that? No, I've never seen a teenager who really wants to be independent or argues for their own control in a situation. Because when I look at these, it feels like this really, it feels really like consistent with what I have experienced in my 25 years with adolescent work, that this is where they're at. So Brooke just asked a really good question. How do you get parent buy-in with these ideas? Yeah, because that's a lot of times our battle.
I would say a couple of things. One is the first thing that would have to be a buy-in is the counselor has to buy into it.
Yeah.
If the counselor's not buying into it, or then you're just teaching stuff that you don't buy into. For parents, it's a matter, I think it's the same thing, is what I would be curious as to how they can view their kid in a different way.
Well, and I think the other thought is, does anyone, like as adults, don't we want these things? Like really as adults, Gina does. She's raising her hand. She's like, I want these.
No, so here's what I do with, I work mostly with, I'm a school-based therapist, so I'm in the schools, and mostly the problems that I hear from the kids are with their parents or with their peers, you know. And so with the parents, I'm really big on perspective. So I take them back, I take the kids back to like when you were first born, mom and dad or whoever was your guardian or caretaker, they loved you, they fed you, they swaddled you, they changed your diaper, they, you know, took you to the doctor when you're sick, and they helped you ride your bike the first time. And they're just teaching you all of these things, and they're keeping you safe because you have a helmet on and all these things. And then when you get to this point in your life, and this is what they've strived for, to get you to this point, when you start to assert your independence, they don't like it because they're like losing you. I need to keep them safe, but they have to understand that they kind of have to fail in order to understand or to learn. And so you got to let them trip and fall, but just be there to go, okay, yep, let's get up and let's move on, you know. So I really use perspective with these kids. And it seems like once they get the parents' perspective on that, they go, oh, okay. And then I also ask them, well, what is your role in this? How do you fit in on this? Because it's always, well, mom and dad, you know. So I always ask them, what is their role? And that's kind of like, oh, wow, So I'm just really, really big on perspective and
Yeah.
the whole. And
Yeah.
And Gina, I think that I love the idea of what is your role in this, because it really makes it creates a self-reflection. It's a respectful question because it's giving them space to define who they are and who they want to be, because a lot of times adolescents are interacting in a reactive way and not in a way that's necessarily congruent to who they want to be. They're just defaulting against the man, they're defaulting against the adult. And so they're not thinking about, oh yeah, I want to be that way. I want to be the person that is a total ass to my parents. And most adolescents really don't want to be that. When you give them space and ask them, what role do you play in this, and what role do you want to play in this? What makes most sense? Because if you go to that next slide, the whole idea of desire for respectful relationships, that's a two-way street. And so how do you act with your parents in respectful ways? How do you create, what do you look like in a respectful relationship? And I think those questions and the context that you give the adolescent you're working with makes total sense. And I think fits real well with these ideas. And I think it's trauma informed, quite honestly.
Well, it is.
Yeah.
It is, because it's more effective. I mean, and it's holding them accountable. Like
Absolutely.
in all these ways, it's how we treat adult clients. So when an adult walks into the office, do you behave differently than you do when an adolescent walks into your office? And when you, other than, maybe you don't use the same examples with an adult as you do with an adolescent, but do you use the same level of respect and consider what they want to see happen, and those kinds of meeting them where they're at, and understanding what they want as well, what their purpose is.
And not to be all academic, but for just a moment, hang with me. But Gina brings up this idea of, I will say to parents, if you're parenting your 15-year-old like you parented them when they were 5, you're going to have some trouble. And Salvador Minuchin and structural family therapy talks about problems occur in families when roles and relationships don't accommodate for the changes that are occurring in the family. And so when an adolescent individually starts changing developmentally, if the parent is still parenting them like they should believe everything they say and listen to everything they say, like a 4-year-old does, because you are the gospel, and they believe that should be what the 15-year-old should do, they're going to get in trouble, because and so I think, the buy-in is, how do you parent how do you parent an adolescent? How do you parent an adult? Because I know I've worked with some adults, 24, 25, 26 years old, that their parents still believe they should be 4, acting like they're 4, and believing and listening. And you could, cross boundaries. You can do all these things that for an adolescent feels disrespectful. And it doesn't feel fair. Because I can't walk into mom and dad's room and go through their stuff.
I think it also sends a message that they're incompetent. as well. And what we're finding in a lot of the college settings is that there's a lot of students who are walking in feeling like they don't know how to make some basic decisions
Yeah.
because they've been treated like they are not competent. So that's, I mean, that's just another reason why it's so important. I mean, we do work with adolescents as well that are coming in and have no respect for any kind of authority or rules or anything, or just common decency. And we have to look back at why,
Yeah.
you know, why are they behaving in this manner? What's happened in their life that has led them to this place, and what's happened in those relationships?
Well, and I think one of the things I liked about this, and this is why I say this isn't the answer, but it gives me an alternative in entering into a relationship. Because when I've worked with that totally disrespectful adolescent, one of the things that I have to be careful about is imposing my will on them and trying to overpower that, because that's probably part of why they're in the place they're at.
Right.
And so I don't want to repeat what has trained them to be where they're at. And I don't want to, so I have to think, this gave me an alternative way to think about, how do I enter into this? How do I do this? And by the way, there's plenty of adolescents that will try to that have tried to convince me that they are going to be disrespectful, and they are exactly what their parents think they are, what other adults think they are. They're going to try to convince me of that, because if I become convinced of that, then I'm going to enter into the relationship the way everybody else does, and they can just use their defaults. They know how to deal with those relationships. But if I become interested in them and ask them, you know, what role do you play in this, and I have them reflecting on themselves, that's an unusual conversation for them oftentimes. And they can't necessarily go to their defaults.
Yeah, it opens up that space for some change.
Yeah.
But then jump to the next one.
Yeah. So these are just some thoughts around how can a counselor have a congruent role to these themes, you know, and so if the counselor has a desire for fairness and mutual respect, and that there is a collaborative way, you know, I think some people have already said this in the chat, how to have the buy-in, how to have a mutual agreement in what this is going to look like. And a desire from the counselor to understand the adolescent's experience and be truly curious about it, as opposed to doing what I used to do and still do sometimes, is I'll be curious and I'll ask a question trying to teach a lesson or make a statement. You know, it's like, well, do you think that there could have been a lot of other ways you could have handled this? That's not curious. I'm telling them that's the wrong way to handle it. You should handle it other ways. And adolescents can sniff that out. And that's it feels disrespectful to them. And so I think I made this one up. Most of my stuff comes from supervisors, but I think this, if you're going to ask a question and if you're curious and want to ask a question, ask a question. If you want to make a statement, make the statement, but don't interact the two. And so if I want the adolescent to do something different, I need to just make the statement.
Yeah, own that statement. And I think that, you know, just pulling in this, the congruent counselor's role, it really is looking at these things and teaching this to the parents as well that we're working with. Like it's understanding with a parent, okay, so what do you really want to see happen here? Do you want, is lecturing working? Does that lecture contribute to the idea that we're understanding the adolescent's experience? Or does that just allow the adolescent to be like, oh, good, this is my punishment, I get the lecture, and then I can move on tomorrow to the same behavior. I just, every so often I have to pay my dues and listen to the lecture. So it's, I think part of it, an answer just to Brooke, as well on the parents buy-in, it's going through and teaching parents what were their developmental milestones. What are the adolescents' developmental milestones? How do you parent in a way that meets theirs? I mean, you could take these 3 slides and just put a handout together that says, here's the goals of adolescence. And here's, how to start working towards meeting these goals as a parent with your adolescent.
And I do believe, maybe it's in March or whenever, Jennifer, you may know this, or Brianne or Mike may know it. We're going to do a training on parenting the out of control adolescent.
Yeah, we have that in March. No, February.
And
Late
part
February.
of part of that is
Michael saying March.
how do you get buy-in, and what does that look like in getting buy-in from the parents? And part of it is understanding adults live in a content and results-based world, and adolescents live in an emotional world. And as soon as the adult, the parent, moves into the emotional interaction as they're getting invited in by the kid, that's not fair. You're not my real mom, and anything to invite the adult into an emotional world. Once they're there, you're on their home field.
Yeah.
And unlike the NFL this past week, most of the time home field advantage makes a difference. And you're not going to win.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. It's some psychoeducation, but that's for a little bit different time.
Yeah. But I think that this is also this is a time for us as therapists to reflect on, do we really have these desires? Do we have a desire to be curious and understand the adolescent's experience? Do we have a desire that this is going to be a mutually respectful interaction and relationship? Do we want them to become independent? Do we want them to learn how to supervise themselves? Do we really want them to be accountable? And do we want them to make the decisions about what that all means? Or do we just want them to do what we say so that it's easier for us and we can move on? Because a lot of times, we get overwhelmed as therapists as well. Like we see a lot of kids or we see a lot of clients and we're like, just come on, make this hour easy. Just listen to what I have to say and then let's move on. So it's asking ourselves, what are the things that we're doing to support this idea? Yeah, Gina is saying what the parents say or what society says. Yeah. Like it's easy. I saw something where somebody said, if so-and-so is paying for therapy, then that's a conflict of interest for the client. So if parents are paying for the therapy, is that a conflict of interest? Like if the parent is our customer telling us what these adolescents should do and say. And of course not. We have an obligation to the person that's sitting in front of us.
I think it's interesting too, because I've done a ton of family therapy where the parents are sitting in the room and with the adolescent, and the parents have a real push for me to do the exact same thing they've been doing. Why don't you tell him that he can't do that? It's like, well, did it work for you? And I don't necessarily say that, but the solution isn't more of the same. And so one of the pushes in family therapy is, as I have a desire to understand the adolescent's experience, it can piss the parents off because he's manipulating you, or and so one of the things is, I'm not going to, because when that happens, then my mind is they have been unintentionally or whatever, they've been trying to control behavior. They have been trying to control this kid. And they've received all kinds of pushback, to the point where I think when you really try to control an adolescent, they will start behaving in ways that are incongruent with who they really want to be. Just because.
Yeah, they get stuck in that emotional response rather than in thinking it through. And so I think it's when we can approach them. I like these questions. It's on this next slide. We can approach them in a way where we're asking them to think. A lot of times the parents and society and all those things, those ideas are rattling around in their head already. They already know what that stuff is. Their parents have been teaching them these things typically. And so it's looking at this.
Yeah.
You know, has an adult ever asked you to follow rules that they don't follow?
Yeah, if you have an adolescent that's not talking, just ask them one of these questions. And they have a million ways. Teachers yelling at them to stop talking so loud, or parents telling them, I don't want you to smoke, as they're, lighting their next cigarette with the one that's going out. And just, there's a million examples. And so it's one of the things to ask yourself, because when I was introduced to these ideas, there was a little bit of push that I had in myself of, I can't let these adolescents get away with this. And then I really had to ask myself, what is that about for me? That I can't do that. I can't. And that was about me more than it was about the adolescent, because the guy was presenting in general adolescence and not in a particular person. And I was still kind of pushing back in my own kind of reflection. And so it's this idea of, and I said this in our last presentation, I'll say it in the next one. I think as counselors, it's our responsibility to have unusual conversations.
Yeah.
It should not be more the same. And so how do we be unusual as adults to adolescents? How do we enter into conversations in unusual ways and not just more of the same, believing, oh, my voice will make the difference? I think the last two slides are really just sample questions that y'all will have. Y'all are getting this PowerPoint. These are kind of general, but you can adjust them to particular situations, particular times. You'll have adolescents tell you a story of, somebody that's being a jerk at the residential place or whatever, and which is when he's being a jerk and he did this and he did that. That, if you think of themes and process instead of the content, the process is, I want respect. This should be respect. And so then you can ask a question like, how do you want to handle disrespect in a respectful way?
I think leads to it leads to a different conversation.
Yeah.
It leads to an unusual conversation.
I think Brooke raised her hand as I was yammering.
Did you raise your hand, Brooke?
Nope, that was an accident.
The
Okay,
kid
we want
who-
to make sure. Brooke's been good at chatting, so that's, in this chat box. I mean, I think, we've given you 2 pages of these questions of engagement. So it's, just the ideas of where did you learn about respect? When a kid is complaining about a situation that, really frustrated them, and it says, where did you learn about what respect looks like? How do you demonstrate respect to other people? It's just having those conversations and maintain that in a curious way. And I think we get to the same place a lot of times. And we can go there in this really respectful manner that allows them to stay open.
And I think to go back to counseling 101, and when you heard content versus process, content is an adolescent's way of inviting you into their emotional space. And so they'll tell stories, they'll be dramatic about it, they'll cuss, they'll do all these things. If you think in terms of what are they really saying, what are the theme that they're hitting on, that's the process. And if you can ask a question off of the process and not get caught in the content, because the content will drive you into whatever invitation they're offering you. And adolescents will invite you to tell them what to do, because they can default into, because that's what adults do. They tell me what to do.
Yeah.
And so if you can think in terms of process and not let the content invite you into those spaces, then you are more likely to have some of these unusual conversations, different conversations than what they're used to.
Yeah. So we've got these questions, and Michael is putting the code in the chat box, by the way. And so we've given you these questions of engagement, and Michael's putting the Google Doc in there too right now, so that
That's
everyone
the
knows to
link
fill
to
that
the
out.
Evaluation, yeah.
Yep. And then we also have the final slide being how therapists can avoid our own resistance. And I mean, it's what John's been alluding to, is that he himself has had that question, like, how do I don't want this adolescent to win. Like, this is kind of a, this is a competition when we get in the room with this adolescent of whose ideas are going to win out in this. And are we viewing it that way? Or are we viewing it in a way where we're really looking at it and saying, how do we create this cooperative interaction? And do we do that with adults? What changes us that when an adult enters the room, like even a 19 or 20-year-old, we're like, oh yeah, they're an adult. I look at them differently than I look at this 16, 17-year-old. And why? And how is that effective? Is that working?
And Jennifer, you bring up that it was so eye-opening to me when I thought, gosh, when I'm working with a 15-year-old and when I'm working with a 20-year-old, how different I think about my role and what I'm allowed to do and what permissions I give myself, in what power I take on in a relationship, how different they are. And to be reminded that an adolescent, a 15-year-old, is beginning to strive to be what that 20-year-old is, but I'm treating them very differently. And so that's the push, is that I'm treating them like a kid when they're pushing to, I'm treating them like I know better. And I would not do that with an adult, where I just come off, unless I'm snarky at some point, but I try not to come off to an adult like I'm way smarter than you.
Right.
But I'm way more willing to do that with an adolescent.
Yep. So we've enjoyed it. I'm seeing the chat. People are saying thank you and just that it's opened up questions. And that's what we hope, is that this is just some good thought-provoking things for you. Looking at ourselves as well as, you know, our clients and how we can have those unusual conversations. We have the references here as well. And so thanks for everybody who participated. Make sure you do your eval and you put in and Michael's posting that again, it's in the chat. So grab it, make sure you get it, and that you get the code word there.
And
Back there
Jennifer
just
and
a
I-
little bit.
Well, I'll stay around. Jennifer, can you?
Yeah.
We'll stay on for a bit if somebody has questions or anything, but don't want to go over.
We know
our
this was
time.
people's lunchtime.
Yes.
Yes,
So-
if you need to leave, thank you. If there's issues as far as the form's not working because of firewalls, just email me and I'm gonna steal the screen for a second, if I can,
You take it, Michael.
and hopefully it will. Yeah, so there's the code. Our upcoming ones, we've got 2 more in February, the 8th and 22nd. So the 2nd and 4th Tuesday. And then John and Jennifer are going to come back in March on the 8th and 22nd and share another 2 classes too. So we appreciate, love everyone coming. Yes, if you have a question here in a minute, stick on and we're more than happy to stay on for a minute and answer some other questions. But yes, if you're looking for the CE, just give me a couple of days. We'll let all of you guys respond to those. And I'll probably try to I'll send you out an email with your certificate, the slides, and a link to the recording. And we'll get those to you in a couple of days. Let everybody fill these out. But if you have any questions, I'll give it back to John and Jennifer and they can answer questions, type in. The code is right there on the screen, COM, so communication 125. You see it there, Jenny? Jennifer just typed it in again. Okay, go ahead. Any questions? Go ahead.
Any thoughts, comments, anything, we're open. Okay, well,
None today.
have any?
I just, my comment is you all are great. I mean,
I know.
this is really fun. So I'm excited to come back in March and hang out because just in the chat and just the ideas from the folks that spoke up, I'm all about how to expand my range. And anytime somebody says something, it's an alternative to me from, even if it's close to what I do, it expands me. And I think and I love that people do that for me. So it's my own selfish part of this.
Well, I think it speaks to that value of doing real interactive kind of trainings too. Is that we all learn from each other, and that's that idea of collaboration. It's the trauma-informed way of presenting too.
Yep. Well, Michael, stop the recording, so because I think we're done.
I kind of thought we'd have someone comment. So yeah, if we don't have any, we can.
And I think, Michael, we're back on February 22nd, right? So we're not doing the February 8th, but